There's a paper doing the rounds at the moment talking about a 25% reduction in all cause mortality for those people who have been COVID vaccinated in the age group of 18 to 59. It's a French study. And it's being shown all around the place to say, yep, this was the right thing to do. You may wonder why I keep on asking the hard questions. The reason is simple. Whenever there are narratives, narratives distort and damage science. If you can't have an objective analysis of anything that is done, it will only cause harm in the long run. So, all I'm doing is I'm asking the hard questions for you, and you can reflect on my opinion on it. This really is the paper. It was published in late 2025, looking at COVID mRNA vaccination 4-year all cause mortality. Now, all cause mortality is important because sometimes if you only looked at COVID mortality, you wouldn't know if people died of other things related to it. And so, all cause mortality was a critical thing. And I was one of the people calling for it from 2021. They were publishing all these papers showing benefits, and I was saying, where is the all cause mortality? So it's good that they're doing it. It's important to note that this is not across the whole of France in terms of the population, 18 to 59 years old. And critically, what they found, in essence, the point that is being raised is this that I've highlighted: a 25% lower risk of all cause mortality in people who had been vaccinated. So that should be wonderful news. And it raises some important questions because if there is such a significant proportion of the population who is COVID vaccinated, we should see significant protection across the population. That's just my logical thinking. So, what I've done is I've gone to our world in data and I've just done a general look at a few points, a few countries here that I think are relevant in terms of what I'm trying to. Three places that are showing at the top here: Singapore in blue. And Singapore had almost, I think, 90% vaccination rate. France had about 80%, and Bulgaria had 30%. Now, this is up to June of 2024. And the reason why I ended up looking at this was because somebody, Peter Tebby, thank you for sending me the email. I do actually read emails sometimes. And he mentioned that they had cut off the all cause mortality in our world in data up to 2025. I can't tell it for certain. All I know is that I'm only seeing up to 2023. But it's still a valuable piece of information to look at because it's objective data. So here is the simple question I would ask. If you are having 25% lower all cause mortality in the vaccinated cohort in France, of which 80% were vaccinated, we should see significant protection beyond the pandemic after the vaccine had been rolled out. And in my mind, that should be expected. Now, it could be that maybe the older cohorts had only negative outcomes that could affect the all-cause mortality across the population. But generally speaking, why would it only benefit the younger cohorts, 18 to 59 years old? So when I then looked again at our world in data, and I looked at excess mortality here, what you have as the zero line, which is very good that our world in data did, is that they did the zero line at 2015 to 2019, that period there. And they were then comparing it. So they kept that baseline across the whole period of time. And what you can see is that this is France here. It remained above that baseline all the way to 2023. This is as far as it goes, December 31st, 2023. It raises actually another question. What happened to the data in 2024 and 2025? I know it takes a little time to put it all together, but goodness gracious, 2 years? Why wouldn't we be able to see that all-cause mortality compared to the 2015 to 2019 period? So the point is, from my simplistic point of view, if you have a population that's 80% vaccinated and with 25% protection against the unvaccinated, I would have expected it to be lower than 2015 to 2019, certainly by the end of 2023. It only dipped for a few times. Everything else remained above. Maybe this is something that was just unique to France, Well, then we asked myself the question, well, what happens if this was not France, but say Singapore? Singapore had like 90% vaccinated across the population, except for maybe children. Everybody was vaccinated. So, based on that, presuming that this benefit wasn't only a French benefit, it should go across the whole population and across the world. And so, therefore, I would expect that for Singapore, which is highly vaccinated with that 25% protection, we would then see a significant situation where the excess deaths were up in 2020, 2021. It should come down quite quickly and be below the 2015 to 2019 baseline. That would be my simple expectation. Well, maybe they imported a lot of really elderly sick people in, but that's not what the reality shows. This now shows, in effect, for Singapore here, this is way above that baseline, up to, at the peak here, 50% higher, and up to the end of 2023, it has remained elevated all through the period. I don't know. Maybe people in Singapore pretended to get the vaccine. Is that possible? Maybe that's why that happened. So, again, I ask a simple question. And again, these are things that anybody can go and look at. It's just in our world in data. And you can look at it, reflect on it. And this is why I'm saying that we need to ask better questions. And so, again, I used another comparison. As I had shown you before, I then asked about Bulgaria. For some reason, the Bulgarians didn't want to get vaccinated. They're only 30% vaccinated. And they did suffer in terms of mortality early in the pandemic. But based on the studies, we would expect that they should continue to be affected because they don't have that 25% protection that would have been given to them. What really would have been the situation for Bulgaria? I'm just finding it here now. And we will probably find that Bulgaria probably had terrible outcomes beyond 2021 because they didn't have the extra protection. But when you actually look at the reality, it's very strange. I've got Singapore on top, and here I've got Bulgaria. What we see in Bulgaria was a massive surge in excess deaths in 2020, September 2021, which would have fit with the Delta wave. So because they weren't vaccinated at that point, they had a higher peak with regards to the Delta wave. But what then happens is the mortality death, because all of these people died. So very quickly, you see coming down, then beyond Omicron, they drop below the 2015 to 2019 baseline. This is what you expect. As you can see, they have mostly trended up to 2023 beyond that baseline. Different from Singapore. How strange. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the data is wrong. Maybe that data about Bulgaria is wrong. Well, I'm just being sarcastic here. Here is what a lot of people don't realize, and I probably haven't highlighted this point enough. When I've spoken about mucosal immunity, we often think only about the upper airway. And the better the mucosal immunity in the upper airway, the less chances you will have of the virus and the viral spike protein bouncing around in your body and triggering vascular inflammation. But there's an important point that can get missed. When we think of mucosal immunity, a lot of people don't realize that, and we're going to publish a paper on this, and it's a very important point. In reality, COVID, even severe COVID, is primarily an intestinal disease. This may sound strange, but when you understand the science, it infects the upper airways and the lungs, it heads to the intestines, and that's where it sits and does all the damage. So if you don't have mucosal immunity in the intestine, it's going to sit there, and it will be very difficult for the immune system to get rid of it. This is what we're seeing at this point, which is why so many people continue to be sick, because they don't realize that in a strange way, intestinal infection of COVID is probably the greatest risk long-term to the population. A really important scientific point. And you cannot effectively train the mucosal immunity with an injectable vaccine. The perfect analogy of this is polio. Polio does a very similar thing. It infects the upper airway, and then it spreads to the gut. From the gut, then you have the virus circulating and getting into the central nervous system, where it causes the paralysis. This is one of the reasons why the polio vaccine eventually, not in all places, but an oral polio vaccine was so critical, because you needed to train the upper airway mucosal immunity to reduce the chance of infection, as well as the intestinal mucosal immunity to protect against it. And this is part of the reason why the polio vaccine was so effective at blocking transmission. This was not the case with the COVID vaccine, because in effect, you needed training at the upper airway mucosal immunity, as well as the intestinal lining mucosal immunity. Possibly, based on what I'm saying, this is why we have this divergence. Because fundamentally, even though the population was hardest hit by Bulgaria early in the pandemic, this population has been trained through natural immunity to have both upper airway and intestinal mucosal immunity. They seem as though long-term, they have had better outcomes. This is almost a perfect example of the race between the turtle and the rabbit. Sometimes slow and steady wins the race, not necessarily fast, safe, and effective. That's a play on words. But the point being that if we don't analyze this science carefully, and we are unable to acknowledge where mistakes are made, and this is the fundamentals. I don't know why it's okay to make a mistake. It's not a problem, because so many things are happening. But we are in a world where acknowledgement of mistakes seems to come with financial liability. And that may be partly the fault of the public, which is why politicians never seem to acknowledge mistakes. The scientific community will block it. Everybody hides away their mistakes. And it doesn't help progression in any form. We have to be able to look at the science, because what will keep on happening with regards to narratives like this, with 25% all-cause mortality protection, it doesn't help the public to understand what happened. And just as a point of humor, I think I'd highlighted this before, is that the protection was so great. I mean, it was such incredible protection if you got vaccinated, that it protected you from transport crashes, as you can see here. It was also slightly protective against falls, so this is incredible. Overall, for any of the things, it was overall protective. Look, it actually, from unintentional injuries, protective as well. So that shows that there is some confounding in the research. And this is the kind of thing that needs to be openly acknowledged, and for us to look objectively at real world data. That's my point, is that if you tell me something in a paper, it's kind of like telling me, if you were to tell me that smokers are protected from lung cancer, but when I look around me, the people who primarily are getting lung cancer are smokers, it should cause me to ask whether or not your interpretation of the science, whatever you got the data from, doesn't fit the reality around me. And these are the questions that the public needs to ask. Ask harder questions. Don't be afraid to do it. Force people to give you the answers, because that's how, as a whole society, we move forward by getting a better understanding as to what is happening around us. Thank you very much for listening. Just as a final reminder, coming up in another few days, COVID Trapdoor. This one is very important about how the viral infection opens different doors to infect even more cells. This is incredibly worrying science, because so much of the virus is still circulating. So we still have a lot more work to do in order to get beyond this very difficult phase. Have a good evening.